Great. Well, I think we're going to get started. We've got lots of folks in the room, and in the interest of time, we're just going to kick off. So, hello again. My name is Cheryl Schoenberg, and I am the Deputy Director of IREX's leadership practice, and I also oversee the Impact Fellowship Network and Summit for IREX. I wanted to welcome you to our 5th installment of the Impact Fellowship Network Virtual Discussion Series. Once again, thank you to all those who've participated in several of our past discussions, and it is great to continue to see so many new faces as well. Today, we're pleased to be collaborating with IFS sponsor Names and Faces as we focus on the power of connections and how we can best create managed serendipity, particularly in the virtual space. We're joined today by Richard Arscott, co-founder of Names and Faces, and Gabrielle Adams, assistant professor and director of executive education at University of Virginia Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. First, Richard and Gabe will start us off with a conversation focusing on the power of inclusive connection and how that can be replicated in a virtual setting, followed by discussions and breakout groups to dig deeper into strategies that can be employed by fellowship programs in this increasingly virtual world to not only facilitate those initial connections between fellows, but also how to keep ongoing engagement with alumni and partners fresh and authentic. Before we start, I want to make just a few announcements. Last month, we sent out communications about two big things. One is fellowship research and an industry report that IFS is partnering with ProFellow to conduct. And maybe some of you tuned into that webinar and even answered the survey that went out. As well, we announced that IFS will be a fully virtual event this year. We've now received great feedback on both the research and preferences around the virtual summit. Look for more information and next steps on the research by the beginning of September. On the summit, which will be held the last week of October, registration is open, and we encourage all of you to reserve your virtual seat if you haven't already. We have reduced the price, given that our direct costs are now much lower doing a virtual event. Now it'll be $200 for an attendee from a large organization and $100 from a small organization. So that's a pretty big reduction. If you've already registered, you will have received a separate communication. Please visit our webpage, which I will throw into the chat for more information and to register. Looking forward, we have one more virtual event in the works for mid-September, which will focus on self-care and wellness, both for ourselves, because we need it too, and our fellows. We'll send out registration information for that event soon. But back to today. We are recording the discussion and plan to make the plenary portions available for anyone who could not attend. We will also be going into breakout rooms for part of the time, and I will warn you before that happens, as you will be automatically moved into a discussion room. We encourage comments in the chat and look forward to an active discussion, but let me hand it over first to Gabrielle Adams, who will lead the presentation with Richard Arscott. Over to you, Gabe.
Thank you. Everyone, it's so nice to see you here. Thank you so much for joining. Rich, do you actually want to just start off by saying a little bit about who you are, your background and everything? I can do the same.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gabe. I'm Richard Arscott. I'm one of the co-founders of Names and Faces. My background is actually in branding and advertising. I spent 25 years working for a big brand. And 3 or 4 years ago, Names and Faces with my co-founder, Paul Galatis. I'll talk about this in a second, but Paul actually was a fellow on the Mandela Washington Fellowship in 2014, an IREX fellowship for young African leaders in the US. And that's how we came to work with IREX and IFS.
Thanks, Rich. My name is Gabrielle Adams. I go by Gabe, so please feel free to call me by whatever name you like. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. My background is in social psychology and organizational behavior. So I study and teach about interpersonal and group dynamics. I find people and organizations and groups to be completely fascinating. And one of the things that I'm interested in, and one of the things we're going to talk about today, is the managing of groups that you do as fellowship managers. So I'd actually like to dive right in by asking you all a question. Under the observation that it might have been a while, but think about the last time you met someone who was really worth knowing. The last person who you remember meeting, specifically someone who was either helpful to you, a valuable connection worth knowing, or even someone who became a friend. And think about how much you enjoyed meeting that person. Okay, so who would that person be for you? Once you have that person in your mind, just think about them for a little bit. We don't have those opportunities anymore, right? To state the obvious, in the middle of the pandemic, we are probably not meeting very many people right now. If we are, it's incredibly intentional and planned. But right now, what we aren't doing is going out to, perhaps like social events and like shaking hands and saying, this is who I am, and tell me about who you are. Those connections have gotten lost, and they've certainly gotten lost in the context of the fellowships that you lead and that you facilitate. If you think about the context in which you met this person, so many of the really deep connections we make are unplanned. So they happen at, barbecues or meetups or through common activities. And because we can't do that, it becomes very hard to make those connections feel organic and to make them feel kind of serendipitous. And so that's why we've talked about serendipity as the theme for this session. We really, as humans, enjoy serendipitous connections because there is joy in the discovery process, right? We always like discovering new things, new people, and we like the idea that we're the ones that discovered them. Right? And so even if you are organizing a fellowship or a group of people, people still feel like, even though they're being put in a room, they still like the idea of meeting other people kind of in this organic way, in this sense of like, I made this connection, I made this connection. And so that's the thing that has gotten harder because everyone is meeting on Zoom, very much like in this context, there's very little chance for us to say, oh, hey, tell me about yourself, or what do you do, or how might we have a connection? We just don't meet people that way anymore. So what has happened as a result of this move and this shift to virtual groups and teams, it means that meeting people has to be much more intentional. And that's where I think fellowships can play a role now more than ever. What you do is so meaningful and so important because you are, for some people, their last connection to like this outside world, the last way in which they can possibly meet new people. And so what you're doing is, from my perspective as someone who teaches a lot of, students, MBA students, executive MBA students, that's in some ways your responsibility, and that's this gift that you can give to people by virtue of the programs that you run. And so I was trying to think how it is and what advice I would offer from like the organizational behavior perspective about how to recreate and facilitate the joy of the in-person networking experience, but now virtually, because now more than ever, you are the curators and stewards of that networking process. That is now officially like your role by virtue of running all of these, Zoom meetings. So the purpose of today is to just talk about how you might accomplish that. And I think, I can say a lot about that, but I also think and suspect that many of you have thoughts to contribute and ideas that have worked. So we're also going to do a breakout portion of the session where you can talk about and share some of the things that have been working with you or with your groups, with the other people on this call. So Rich, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say that, Gabe, I'm struck by the effort that goes in sometimes to creating serendipitous relationships that your fellows They may appreciate it, but probably sometimes they don't appreciate the work that you do to create the environment where those relationships can blossom. So the groups that you put together, the tables that you put people on an event that you have thought quite carefully about, and they then discover the shared connection or the serendipitous nature of that relationship. And I think one of the questions for all of you, and the questions in this environment we're living in now, is what is it we can do when our normal tools have been taken away from us to provide tools to do that. One of the things I wanted to get us to think about for a second is the fellows themselves. So Gabe has spoken a little about the role you all play as facilitators in the networks, but think about the fellows who are on the programs and think about what they have signed up for. When they sign up in the first place, what is it that they want? We work with a number of fellowships, from the Mandela Washington Fellowship to the Ford Institute in London. And I spoke to a couple of administrators and a couple of fellows on the program. And what comes through are very generally two sort of buckets that people sign up for. The first is challenge in learning. And the second is, unsurprisingly, it's in the name, is fellowship. And there is a belief that the two can't really be done fully effectively unless they're done together, that they supplement each other. You can't learn as effectively in isolation from one another, and you can't build the community and network without that shared interest that holds the fellowship together. And so one of the challenges is, how can we bring both of those things to the fore? And the question I want to ask from the fellows' perspective, if those are the two things that people sign up for, what are the problems that they're facing and we are facing today in helping them get to that? There will be people that I, as a fellow, am forced together with. I might be put into a group with someone. But in normal life, there are people I am drawn towards. There are people who I just think, well, that person looks friendly, I'm going to go and speak to them. Or I've been introduced by someone I've already met, and they know that there's a connection, so they're able to facilitate that connection. And so that can be, engaging in a virtual environment, engaging in a network can be very hard. It can be very hard to get context for who everyone is and where they fit in. You need to get through a series of questions quite quickly in a conversation to begin to say, okay, I know who this person. Gabe maybe can talk about this a bit more later, but it's that human thing of, I introduce myself so you know my name. Even my name tells you something about perhaps where I'm from, or my background, or my history. But then I ask the questions about, where are you from? What do you do? What have you done in the past? How can we shortcut that kind of information gathering that gives me a bearing on the relationship? The other things that I think are hard are this concept of, how do I get my hands around the whole program? If I walk into a room, I can see the size of a gathering. When I'm just on a Zoom call, I can't see. So it's a bit like this webinar, actually. I'm sort of flicking between how many people are on it. It's like, how many people am I speaking to? And what's the context for that? And then the third thing that I think we need to acknowledge is our minds are full. They are really full of information, and probably most of the fellows on your programs, it might well not be the primary organization in their life. They might work for a company or be a student at a particular establishment, and then the fellowship is an additive on that. So I think bearing in mind those problems of, how can I get context? How can I overcome the intimidation of walking into these situations? How can I get my hands around the organization? And how can I help someone because their mind is already full, are the new problems that we're solving for. In fact, they're very similar to the old problems, but they're in a nuanced context. And I think it's the situation we're in. Okay. Talk a little about the context, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing, Rich, that you said that struck me that I'm now realizing too, is that we have to be much more intentional about networking and who we network with, but also, I think the point of having information up front about who fellows are solves another problem that I didn't realize until just now that we actually have, which is how to extract ourselves from situations where we don't have a ton of time right now, right? We're all trying to manage working from home, kids, just tons and tons of Zoom calls all day. When you have information about people, it tells you exactly how long you need to spend on a conversation with someone up front and how long you should plan to have that conversation in your calendar. So that's another thing that strikes me
is there an official minimum, Gabe, for how long you can speak to someone on a Zoom call before you are able to exit the Zoom call and say this wasn't necessarily the relationship that I wanted? Because because in a social setting, you can sort of do that, and there are skills that you can have because you can kind of turn to the other person in the conversation and begin a conversation with that person, and then it just drifts off. Whereas, yeah, I feel that 3.5 minutes, which you can probably get away with at a cocktail party, is not acceptable in a Zoom. So, look, I'm not sure this is the conversation I was looking to have in the first place.
I think that's why we just have to be so much more mindful about who we set Zoom calls up with in the first place, because there's no such thing as a 3.5 minute conversation on Zoom. We use, for behavioral research, we use all sorts of cues to signal that we're done talking to someone, right? Everything from like looking away, looking and turning to someone else, turning our body around. I have to go to the bathroom. I have to go get another, refill my drink. We can't do that on Zoom anymore. And so it just suggests that what we need is information in the first place to know whether you should even set up a Zoom call with someone in the first place, and whether this person is worth your time. When we're trying to make those judgments, social psychological research suggests that there's sort of two things that we're thin slicing about people when we meet someone. Those two things are that person's warmth and their competence, right? So if you think about all of the traits that you use to describe other people who friendly, funny, smart, these sorts of adjectives that we use, they can all boil down essentially to how likable, warm, and friendly is this person, and how competent are they? How likely are they to be able to carry out what their intentions are? And there's actually an evolutionary, basis for that. If you are like out in the middle of the wilderness, you come across another human being, you need to immediately assess, what are this person's intentions toward me? And does he or she have the capacity to actually act on and carry out those intentions? So are they friend or foe? And how can they be useful, or how are they potentially a threat or a danger to me? And so when we meet new people for the first time, that's the exact kind of information we're trying to assess. And that's the information, if I'm boiling it down very, very simply, that people on your fellowship programs want to know about one another, right? They want to know, could this person potentially be a friend, or could this person potentially be useful in my career? What can I know about them, and how would that be helpful to me? And so when I talk about, sorry?
I was going to say, we see that with names and faces, that there are two levels to that. You talked about in the first instance in a relationship, but there's also the second instance and the third instance of a relationship. The purpose of that initial meeting is so that you have some sense of permission to go back to that person. And I think in a fellowship, that can be years between that initial meeting, and the person might not even remember it. But if you can remember the occasion, okay, well, we met at that occasion. Yeah, I do remember that. And I think there's information we see that helps to form the relationship. And that can be shared context. Oh, we went to the same school, or oh, we both have an interest in sustainability, or whatever it might be. There's shared context, and then there's the sort of personal information that people might share, and then there is secondary information that might be useful when I'm searching my fellowship for a needle in a haystack. I need someone who can help me with sustainability, and I can find, okay, here are all the people. Oh, wow, I met that person. Maybe I should reach out to that person. Or even I didn't meet that person, but we're in the same fellowship year, or there's some shared context. So for me, it's dual. It is building the relationship in the first instance, but it's then having access and permission to reach out to have the relationship in the second context as well.
Yeah. And I think about this in the context of the role that you all have as again, as stewards and curators now of networks, and the responsibility that comes with that in the time when social connections are just fewer and farther between, that all of a sudden becomes a much bigger responsibility and a much bigger aspect of your jobs, and something that I think has to therefore be planned for and must be done quite thoughtfully and quite intentionally and deliberately, and with consideration for, you don't have to be a matchmaker, but you certainly need to think about what is the group of people, what are the dynamics that are going to mesh well together.
Let me just say one more thing. I know we're short on time. We want to leave time for the discussion. There is also a sense, I think, in trying to understand, once I have this information, what role we need to play in as leaders of fellowships in allowing these relationships to take place. And we're so overwhelmed, I think, as individuals by communication and communication channels. There is a question about, once we facilitate it, what else do we have to do to let that relationship flourish? So I don't think it's simply about context in a relationship. It's also about what forums are we creating then to let people have those conversations, and do we even need to create that? Are there enough forums for people to have conversations with themselves, and is another forum or another inbox actually an imposition on people?
Which I think is a perfect seg actually into our breakout rooms, because my sense and my guess is that you all have a lot of ideas about that you might be able to share with one another in terms of what you're doing or what you're considering. And so in the breakout rooms, I'm going to send around in a chat 3 questions that I'm hoping that you will discuss. And one of us will be facilitating those small groups as well. But what I want you first to introduce yourselves to one another and appoint maybe 1 to 2 people to kind of take or share notes and summarize the group's discussion for this larger group. But the 3 questions that I have for you to discuss are, number 1, why is it important for your fellows to know one another? Right? And that might be something very practical, like they're going to spend the next 20 days together, to we hope to build relationships later on. So question number 2, what information is it most important for them to know about one another right away? Right? So not only what information should they know, but if you had to prioritize that information, what is it critical for them to know? And then 3, the theme of the discussion is, how can you help people discover each other, their interests, their commonalities before they even come together? How do you inject that sense of serendipity? How do you make that process feel organic, like a process of self-discovery when it's virtual, right? When it's not occurring in the context of a, networking party essentially, or a meetup or something like that. So here are those questions in the chat, and I would ask that maybe you copy and paste them so that you can also put them in your group chat. But I think now we will, Cheryl, you're going to help put us into breakout rooms?
Yes, so I will create the breakout rooms. You'll be taken into one automatically. But as Gabe mentioned, we'll also be facilitating in each of those rooms and be able to bring in the questions. So it should take you in seamlessly. It'll just take a moment for it to happen. So I will open and create those rooms right now.
So the facilitators will be Marina, Cheryl, Rebecca, Rich, and myself. So you will see one of us soon.
And then the other thing is, when the time is up, you'll get a countdown for when the room's closing, so that it doesn't, does not just pull you out. Abruptly. Okay, so I will open the rooms now, and we'll all see you in there.
Are we all here?
It looks like we are, yes.
Wow, it's hard to facilitate discussion when but we're on Zoom with people on mute. But thank you to my group; they did amazingly. But you sort of, what an unnatural environment.
I feel like I learned so much out of that.
Me too.
Yeah, and I think so we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to spend 5 of those just hearing what ideas came out in your group for how to kind of preserve the sense of serendipity. I know my group had some really great ideas, and I don't want to cold call them, but maybe we can start with that group, move around the room, the virtual room. So what did you all come up with?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going back. So when we were talking about why do fellows need to know about one another, there were really two major themes. One, to build that sense of trust and allow for vulnerability, and then secondly, that creates a foundation for then pursuing collaborations and learning exchange to achieve systemic change in their sectors or across sectors. And then did you want me to do the next piece? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yes, so then there were some great ideas around what to share, and Erin had said from her program that folks share their bio, what they want to share with others ahead of time before they meet, and then but primarily when they do get together, there's icebreakers, which really helps to build that trust and vulnerability and getting to know one another. And other tools are, in addition to meeting monthly, they have happy hours and small group discussions, as well as just checking in on one another and their regular programming. So, and then Cole mentioned the idea of having a shared vocabulary of everybody sort of explaining about who they are and what they do, and how their interests and their pursuits have a shared language, and how to speak about those things with a shared language. Am I missing any major theme? I mean, the other piece about collaboration was about learning new perspectives. So from one another was a key element there. So.
Great. What else did you all come up with?
About the report out from our breakout group?
Sure. So we had a similar discussion around why it's important for fellows to get to know each other, building the trust and vulnerability to have a powerful learning environment. The only thing I'd add is to say, we also talked about the support structure that fellows can provide to each other as they wade into new systems where sometimes they might be being asked to change things, to insist all systems resist change. So having support for each other, and also having a place to reflect and hear the truth from other leaders who want the best for them and can give them honest feedback about how they're showing up. Information they should know about each other. There were lots of great ideas, all combined in the last two questions, and how people discover each other. Atlas Core has something they do called 5 facts. They give everybody, these are the 5 things we want you to share each time you're networking. Some professional, some fun. That has also, in a virtual space, turned into introductory videos that each person does before they come in. Another idea that another group shared was sharing a prompt. This sounded like a lot of fun. Sending out a prompt each week, and then people respond with just a photo about how they interpreted that question, but just giving people a stronger sense of each other. We had lots of shared ideas around get to know you questions, you know, everything from what your background is to what your superpower is. Foster America is going to be doing how-to manuals. Each fellow is going to do how-to manuals for themselves, what they need, what they offer, what it's like working for them, working with them. Favorite books, those kinds of things. That's what I remember. Anything else from the crew?
I think the only other thing is that the usefulness of doing prep work before even initial meetings can help people kind of have a sense of who's in the space and who they might want to be connecting with, particularly around certain things, because there's some connection there they see, whether it's a social issue or you know, identity or some, you know, sector issue. So I thought that was a really good kind of, particularly just being in the virtual space as we are right now, that's a particularly important thing, is to give people multiple opportunities to learn about each other, even before coming into a space like this.
Great. Let's hear from one more group, and then I will help Rich and I will wrap things up.
We've been using, we've been trying to incorporate a lot of art and music in our kind of virtual gatherings. First, we understand the importance of art during like tumultuous times, and trying to like offer a different kind of experience on Zoom. So we've been closing out a lot of our virtual sessions with like an artist, doing 2 songs that are connected to, usually, some sort of social theme. But yeah, that's been, I think, powerful to have that be the last word as we sort of sign off.
That's great, thanks. I see there's also information going on. There's a little chat, side chat going on. Kristen's trying to get some information about that exercise with the photos. So I would recommend anyone who wants info about that exercise, stay tuned on Zoom until she's able to get it. So don't hang up. But Rich, what I was thinking in terms of wrap up. So one of the things we know from behavioral science is that implementation of kind of like the ideas that we have is much more likely when you actually make a plan, right? And we know that this is true for voting, right? If you make a plan for how you're going to vote, you're much more likely to vote than if you don't make a plan, like, get in your car, drive to the polling station. So I was thinking it might be helpful to just think about, like, if you choose an idea that you heard about that you liked today, and think about how you would actually implement it. What would that take? Just jot down a few notes to yourself, or just think mentally in your head what that would look like. Because my hope from this conversation is that we have underscored the importance of how important it is to kind of do that pre-work, help fellows get to one another before they even land in the online virtual environment. Whether it's through, someone's mentioned, face flyers, but whatever that vehicle is for communication, once you have that information, how are you actually going to make these connections happen? Right.
A separate but related point that came up in our group, and I think it was mentioned in the summaries of other groups as well, was, and I know that, Gabe, you're talking about what administrators can do, what the plan that they can make, but was also this idea of vision for fellows before an event, the ability to revise who was going to be at something. So this idea of them making a plan of, okay, so here's everyone that's going to be at this. It would be really interesting to speak to her, or really interesting to speak to him, and I'll see if I can find them. So I think that, making a plan flows through into how fellows need to behave as well. So there's definite merit in doing that.
That's great. Perfect. We have 3 minutes left. We can, I know you all have other things. Are there questions that Rich and I can answer? Any other thoughts that you'd like to conclude with? You can also wait around for that photo exercise.
I have a question, and maybe it's too meaty to get into in the time we have remaining, but I think like I was in a focus group yesterday with some fellows, and what we're struggling with is both how to support introverts in networking in the virtual space, and sort of giving them permission to reach out to people, encouraging them to do that. How much do we self-facilitate, and how much do we leave up to them? And I think a compounding factor to that is time. And so we hear from a lot of our fellows that it's just a struggle. We place fellows in a work, basically like an internship, and also have programming. And so this tension between being accountable to their work and also participating in the learning. And I think that compounds the issue around creating those more serendipitous moments. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but it's definitely a challenge that we're encountering as we transition to a more virtual model.
Totally. I mean, the thing about people who are introverted is, I think that like you have to find the context in which they're not introverted, right? Because no one is introverted all the time. And I'm sure that there are introverts on this call, for example, right? Like I'm actually an introvert, being an academic. But you have to find the thing that they're either passionate about, or the thing that like, gives them energy, right? That doesn't, because like the thing about introverts is that social interactions can like really feel energy sapping, right? Yes. I see the nod there. And what is either the social interaction, or what is the thing that will get them you know, to like open up. And once you find that, and maybe it's through consultation with them, that's the way to kind of like hook them in.
Gabby, could I share a comment on that that follows on what you're saying? When we had our first welcome call with all of the fellows in the spring, we had all of them, in addition to introducing who they are, their college and field of interest, we had each one of them say what's one thing that brings them joy right now, which is really important during COVID. And that was the thing that actually got threaded through the program. Is within the fellowship, they would connect with each other on, oh, have you cooked a new recipe lately? Or so things that might seem to be kind of an energy zap. It was the second we would mention, oh, have you taken your dog for a walk? Have you planted any new flowers? Whatever it is, they would immediately just light up on the Zoom screen. So I think whatever question you can plug into their intro spiel at the beginning of the fellowship, and then revisit that whenever it's appropriate and whenever it makes sense, they're just going to come back to life, because it demonstrates you listened to what they said at the beginning, and that it's something that they want to talk about. And that will then be a gateway to them talking about more things that is part of the maybe the more structured fellowship.
Absolutely.
Thank you both so much.
Well, thanks everyone. We're actually a minute over, and I just wanted to first thank Gabe and Rich for leading this presentation and posing really thoughtful questions to all of us. Thank everyone for their active participation. This has been really enlightening, and I think what we can do is pull some of this information together. I know Kristen wasn't able to pull up that information on that activity, but she will send it to me, and we will follow up with some of the ideas that were generated here for everyone, and with a little bit more information about names and faces as well, to learn about, because it's a platform for connecting people. So thank you again. Look forward to seeing you all at our next event, and hopefully at the summit as well. And you'll be hearing from us shortly with the follow-up from this discussion. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
See you. Yes, it's great to see faces.
Bye.